In this video, we're going to look into page 16 to 19 of your book. Like previous videos, I'm going to explain the difficult vocabulary first, and then I'll talk about the plot and characters. So let's begin. This is page 16 of your book. The inspector has finished talking to Mr. Burling, and it was Sheila's turn now. And Sheila was in the drawing room, and now she entered the dining room again. And this is the beginning of page 16. Let's take a look at these words. Number 1, the stage direction, gaily, gaily. Gay means happy. So it's not about gay relationship, but gay, this word means happy. So Sheila talked happily. And the second word, drawing room. Remember, I have explained this word before already. Drawing room is a room to entertain guests in the old times. And it's not a room really for drawing. You can consider drawing room as your living room that your guests will stay after dinner and chit-chat and entertain themselves. The next word, abruptly, abruptly. It means suddenly. So Mr. Burling suddenly said something after the inspector said that the interview, the investigation wouldn't be ending soon. Okay, the next word, run along. Mr. Burling asked Sheila to run along, meaning to ask her to go away. And then number 5, uncalled for. You can see a hyphen in between words. Normally, they should be adjectives. So uncalled for means unfair, rude. Mr. Burling was saying that inspector was uncalled for. So the inspector was rude, and it was unfair for the inspector to ask a question like this. The next word, officious. It means assertive, meaning that it's being forceful. So the inspector kept forcing people to answer his question. That's officious. And on the last phrase, dragged into. Dragged into. It means getting involved. So Mr. Burling didn't want Sheila to be dragged into the case. So Mr. Burling didn't want Sheila to be involved in the case. Okay, this is page 17 of your book. Take a look at these words. The first word in the stage direction for the inspector, impressively, impressively. So the inspector has to speak this line impressively, trying to impress Sheila, to show off and make Sheila admire him, basically because of his authority as a police. And then the inspector explained that Eva Smith died in the afternoon. Alright, and then the second word, justified, justified. It means that you have a good reason to do something, then you are justified. You have a reason to explain your action, that this is justified. And then the last word here, distressed, distressed, meaning it's extremely anxious, sad, unhappy, and painful. Distressed. When Sheila heard about the suicide case of Eva, she was distressed. She was very upset. And then page 18 of your book. There are only 2 words I want you to take a look. The first one, bewildered, bewildered. It means confused, puzzled. You have something that you don't understand, bewildered. The next word, perturbed, perturbed. It means worried. So that when the inspector said that he still had questions to ask other members, so the rest of the members, they were confused, they had questions, and they were perturbed, meaning that they were worried. Because they were worried that they would be involved in this suicide case. This is still the page 18 of your book. And when inspector said that he still had questions with other people, and Mr. Burling immediately changed his tone. So in the stage direction, marked change means a sharp change that everyone may notice. A sudden change in the tone. And then the second phrase that I want you to pay attention to will be cutting in. Cutting in, second, cutting in. It means interrupting, stopping Sheila from speaking. Just cut in. Okay, and this is page 19 of your book. So it's right before Sheila was asked question. Here are some words that I want you to pay attention to. Number 1, sensibly, sensibly. So it means in a way that shows wisdom, it makes sense, sensibly. And then the second word, concerned, concerned. So it means that you're worried or you're anxious about. So Gerald was saying that he never knew someone called Eva Smith, so he was not worried. It's nothing related to him. And now the last one, spoiled. Spoiled. It simply means spoil. You destroy something, like the hope or everything for Eva. So when Sheila learned that Mr. Berlin fired Eva Smith, Sheila thought that this would spoil everything for this poor girl. So destroyed everything. So that's it for the difficult vocabulary from page 16 to 19, and I'm now moving on to the plot. So let's take a look at the story now. On page 16, Sheila just entered the dining room. She was in the drawing room with Mrs. Berling and Eric before. And when Sheila entered the room, she realized that she interrupted the investigation between the inspector and Mr. Berling, so she apologized. From the stage direction, gaily, you can identify Sheila's personality. She was a happy girl. She was always excited. But at the same time, when she realized that the inspector was here, she kept her manner by apologizing. So when Sheila asked why it took them so long to move to the drawing room, and she realized that the inspector was there investigating, and Mr. Berlin replied saying that they would end soon, but the inspector didn't agree. Mr. Berlin thought that it was only about him because he fired Eva Smith, but that's not what the inspector intended to do, because the inspector was here to question everyone in the family, if you have already read the book. So when Sheila was interested, she was curious and asked what happened, and Mr. Berlin simply asked her to run along, to leave the room. It was none of her business, and Mr. Berlin didn't want Sheila to get involved. But the inspector asked Sheila to stay, and that made Mr. Berlin really angry, because Mr. Berlin thought that it was very rude to ignore what he just said. And he was thinking to report him, to complain about him. Of course, someone so rude suddenly just showed up at your house, kept on questioning you, forcing you guys to do things. That's why Mr. Berlin wasn't happy. And he didn't understand why his daughter, Sheila, needed to get involved. And Sheila was really innocent. She didn't know what was happening and kept asking what happened. And so the inspector officially introduced himself to Sheila, saying that she was the inspector and a young girl died by drinking a lot of disinfectant, dying in pain, burned her inside out. And take a look at Sheila's reaction. She thought that it was very horrible, just like how Eric reacted. Do you still remember how Eric reacted and how Mr. Berlin reacted? While Eric thought that it was very horrible, Mr. Berlin didn't care. And Sheila here found it very horrible too. Remember these information and we'll do some comparison later on. And the inspector continued to explain that she wanted to end her life. And Mr. Berlin continued to think that it was nonsense, simply because he discharged her, he fired her, and she killed herself, and that made him responsible for her death. So Mr. Berlin thought that this is nonsense. But Eric thought that Mr. Berlin started it. So to Eric, Mr. Berlin was the one who should be responsible as well. But to Mr. Berlin, he thought that his action was justified. He thought he had a good reason to fire Eva because Eva was the ringleader of a strike, asking for more salary. And then Gerald agreed. As a businessman, of course, Gerald understood Mr. Berlin better. And Gerald said if it was him, he would do the same. But then Sheila expressed how upset she was after hearing the news, even though it was her engagement dinner that night. And she kept asking questions about the girl. She was curious. Do you think it's a good thing? If she continued to ask questions like this, what would happen to her? And the inspector patiently told Sheila that Eva Smith was 24 years old and she was really pretty before. But of course, when the inspector met this girl in the afternoon, Eva was in pain. She wasn't pretty at that moment. And then both Mr. Berlin and Gerald told the inspector to stop talking. And Gerald asked the inspector to focus on what happened to Eva after she was fired by Mr. Berlin. Because to Gerald, he thought that after Mr. Burling fired Eva, what happened to Eva, it was nothing related to the whole family and him. So he wanted to switch the focus of the inspector towards the things happening after Eva was fired. The reason why both Mr. Burling and Gerald stopped the inspector talking is to protect Sheila because she was a very naive girl. They were worried that Sheila may said something wrong. It's also to protect themselves by not putting themselves into any scandal that may affect their reputation and also Mr. Burling's knighthood. And when Gerald said that you shouldn't ask us questions because we wouldn't know what happened to Eva after she was fired by Mr. Burling. And then the inspector said, "Are you sure you don't know?" And then he looked at Gerald, Eric, and Sheila. What does this stage direction imply? It implies that the inspector knew that Gerald, Eric, Sheila had relationship with Eva Smith. It's just that they didn't know themselves. And Mr. Burling was pretty smart. He could get the meaning from the inspector's speech, and he realized that the inspector wasn't here just to talk to him about Eva Smith being fired by him. And then the other four, Gerald, Eric, Sheila, and Mr. Burling, they exchanged some strange, weird look. They were puzzled and they were worried because they knew that they would be involved in this suicide case. And all of a sudden, Mr. Burling changed his tone because now he realized it's something bigger than he imagined. It was way more serious than he imagined because other family members were involved in this suicide case as well. And then he apologized to the inspector. So you can still see that even Mr. Burling liked showing off, bragging about his relationship with people. He still had some sense and manners, and he didn't really insist if something else happened. And if someone else made a mistake, he wouldn't insist that they were right. This was kind of person Mr. Burling was. But of course, when the inspector continued to talk, Mr. Burling still didn't believe that any of the family members would be involved. And the inspector didn't agree, and Sheila said that it's like everyone was responsible for the girl's death. And at this point, Mr. Burling immediately stopped Sheila from talking. He was afraid that Sheila would say something wrong and put the whole family into trouble. When Mr. Burling tried to invite Inspector to talk privately, Sheila was really childish, and she really thought that the inspector needed to question others and everyone else should answer all the questions honestly. If you were Mr. Burling, you would think that Sheila was a little bit childish, right? So the last part before the inspector started questioning Sheila, Mr. Burling explained that he was just trying to protect Sheila, helping her to make a wise choice. And Gerald immediately clarified that he had no relationship with this Eva Smith. But was it true? And Eric denied as well. Sheila said she had never heard of this name Eva Smith before as well. But the inspector explained one more time. People like Eva Smith, lower class, working class women, they might use more than one names. So after Eva was fired by Mr. Burling, she needed to change her own name from Eva Smith to something else. Probably to help her get another job, or maybe she was upset about this incident. And when the inspector tried to explain this, Eric thought that it makes sense to him. Couldn't blame Eva Smith. And Sheila agreed too. Sheila thought that Mr. Burling firing Eva Smith actually spoiled everything for her. So they believed that Mr. Burling was responsible, at least a certain extent. So that's it. And in the next video, from page 19 to 26, we will know what happened to Sheila, and we will know why Sheila was involved in this suicide case. Thank you for watching.